Yeah, who cares? All right, I think we can get going here. Good morning, everybody. It is Monday morning, the first day of December, 2025. Um, there's always so many things to hit on a Monday morning, and I haven't talked about these things since last Tuesday, which indicates maybe I should do this more often. However, I don't have the time. I am burdened with several other things. I mean, burdened with several other things right now that are taking up all my time and energy. But that's enough belly aching. Good morning. Welcome, K Talk. Welcome, Global Affairs Unfiltered. I'm Jack Stockwell. We'll be here for an hour trying to go over everything that is pertinent to my worldview that I think to some degree I share with some of you. Let me get open to my messages so that I can see what's going on. So thank you. Hello to all of you. The world is clearly an absolute turmoil. The very things that I was looking to see them calm down with my vote for Donald John Trump have just gone exactly the other direction into absolute turmoil. And just to list them, just briefly to list them, you've got the Ukraine crisis boiling, even though Witkoff and Kushner are ready to take off and go talk to Putin. And I want to go through the comments before the program's over today, go through the comments that Putin has made regarding the 28-point plan. And so you got the Ukraine crisis boiling, you've got the genocide going on in the Middle East, International Amnesty International just reported the other day the genocide is indeed continuing. And in the West Bank, more and more Palestinians who have every right to that property are being run out of town by the IDF, making the property available for Jewish immigrants. Well, maybe I should say Israeli immigrants. I just assume they're Jews. Which may not be the most fair thing. Anyway, you got this pending danger of military intervention in Venezuela. So if your boys and girls are good with a gun and this Venezuela thing breaks out and it develops, as a lot of podcasters are talking about, myself as well, into the latter-day Vietnam, just as Germany has legislation to reinstate their draft, it's not out of the question here. You've got this new crisis between Japan and China showing up now. And the only thing I can say in the beginning of my comments here is that there are also voices of reason going on in the midst of all this turmoil that clearly show how the world could get out of these problems. And I just want to state at the beginning here that President Putin at a conference of the Collective Security Treaty Organization in Bishkek, I don't know if you've ever been to sunny downtown Bishkek, I haven't, just said something that we have been talking about here for almost 4 years now, and that is the need to have a new security and developmental architecture. And when you hear this, when you hear Putin say this stuff, when you hear it come out of Harley, his voice, the Schiller Institute, you hear it coming out of Orban, even Lula from Brazil. What they're talking about is setting up a system so that even the weakest among us is protected. And Putin calls for this equal, indivisible. He called it the indivisible security architecture, which just means this very formation would be open to every country of the world. Otherwise, it wouldn't be indivisible. So my demand that we get these Western nations to agree to cooperate with the global majority is the only way to solve these problems. It's completely feasible, even realistic proposition. But just to touch briefly on these hotspots, the Ukraine situation, where the news just arrived, is that the presidential advisor Yermak is out. He apparently resigned in Kyiv. Apparently, the corruption case that's growing against Zelensky reached the presidential advisor Yermak as well. He just resigned and quit. If he isn't on a flight already, he'll probably be on a flight coming up here pretty quick to Miami, I guess, somewhere he's going to hide out with his billions. Obviously, that's got a lot to do with the corruption scandal, which touched him in a direct way. But this situation, this growing corruption scandal, and I don't know why it's new. I mean, we've been talking about this for months. Anyway, there was this leaking of this 28-point program, supposedly from the Trump administration, and then all hell breaks loose. And the international media and the warmongers tried to present it as a printout of the Russian program. And while that's going on, Pistorius, who's the defense minister of Germany, and many others of the coalition of the willing, have gone into this uproar saying no dictate, no territorial concessions, as though they can control the future of the Ukraine. Actually, this plan does have some major points which address the core interests that are represented by Russia, which is why Putin took the time to make some comments on this peace plan. But why should Russia not insist on what it wants, given the fact that these core interests were the reason the special military operation started in the first place? Number one, no NATO for Ukraine. Number two, the Donbass is now under the control of and will become hereafter part of the Russian Federation. And then very strict conditions for the rest of Ukraine, involving the size of their army and trade relations, trade agreements, and a constant watch on the part of the FSB as to what's really going on. So, in the advice of experts like Harold Kuyat, who I've quoted many times, former chief of staff of the German army and part of the NATO military command a number of years ago, that Germany, France, and Great Britain should agree on this proposal because it's the only game in town. And if they reject this proposal, the military operation is going to continue, and given the absolute massive progress Russia has been making, especially in the last several weeks, it can only end up worse with a military victory for Russia. And that, according to Kuyat, would have more severe security implications for Europe. So it comes down to this. You sit down and, lay your cards on the table, and you realize you don't have any cards to play. And you sit down with the Russians, as Trump told Zelensky some time ago, you have no cards to play, buddy. You're being eaten alive by the Russian army. There's 3 divisions now that are completely surrounded by the Russian army, telling the members of these divisions, lay down your arms and surrender or be destroyed, one or the other. Which is why they're having a tremendous desertion rate right now in the Ukrainian army. Now, what's emerging in the U.S. administration is this division that had I been told a few months ago that this was going to happen, I wouldn't have believed it. And that is, you've got, on the one hand, you have President Trump, Vice President Vance, and the new Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll, who is now the special representative responsible for the Ukraine, and Witkoff on one side. And these are the people who are trying to get an agreement to go along with the 28-point plan. And then you have a very openly, very vocal, very expressive Marco Rubio being in absolute opposition to the president, to the vice president, to the Secretary of the Army, and to Witkoff. And he flew in. I saw the news coverages. He flies into Geneva, lines up with the coalition of the willing. Now get this image in your mind. On the one hand, you have the president, the vice president, the Secretary of the Army, and Witkoff. And on the other hand, you've got Rubio meeting with the coalition of the willing, meaning France, Germany, and England, to keep the war going. So you have the president's Secretary of State doing what he can to keep the war going, being pushed by ilk members of the Senate like Lindsey, old Lindsey from South Carolina, and others, uh, I I'm almost without words. When I read this morning in the news, there's a big split going on in the administration. How long will the president leave Rubio in there? Well, I don't think the Rubio was really the president's decision. I think it was the neocons' decision. And this represents an even greater retrenchment for the neocons in the administration with what Rubio's representing. And he's there trying to get this counterposition to not give up on the war, but to just keep plowing forward to create a strategic defeat for Russia, which is laughable. Obviously, and then Bloomberg comes in, revealing the so-called taped telephone call between Witkoff and his Russian counterpart, which is supposedly the proof that Witkoff is just another Putin puppet trying to instigate Russiagate 2.0. Obviously, this is an extremely heated situation where I was listening to Colonel McGregor over the weekend, for example, has maintained the hypothesis that a coup is in the making against Zelensky. And Putin said, in any case, no legal deal with Zelensky is possible anyway, given the fact that Zelensky is no longer the legitimate president of the Ukraine. So it's in a constant state of flux, but it's interesting that Putin wants to sit down and talk about the 28-point plan. And those people who've been betting on regime change in Russia, which of course means a strategic defeat, means a regime change and then getting Putin out of office, possibly getting a more pro-Western government in Russia, these people should think twice, because right now, the latest poll that I saw towards the end of last week, 80% of the Russian population in the Russian Federation is supporting Putin, supporting the government, supporting the war effort. 80%, even though they've had, I don't know, several 100,000 of their own dead or their own casualties, not the 1 million plus that the Ukrainians have, but at least 200,000 or so. And yet 8 out of 10 Russians support Putin in the efforts. And according to an interview that was done by the Hungarian journalist Eva Peli, who I have quoted in the past, P-E-L-I, with Sergei Karaganov, it happened back on October 30th, just the day before Halloween, which I would suggest you can get the English translation. Sergei Karaganov, spelled like it sounds, and Eva Peli, P-E-L-I. Because every now and then somebody in a very important position in the political structure of a particular government comes out in an interview and says some things that you would not be expecting them to say, with candor, to the sense that, are they giving signals, or are they telling us what's to come? Because this interview gives a very interesting insight to the depth of what a certain faction of the Russian establishment is thinking. And compared to that, one can only say that President Putin is an unbelievably patient and diplomatically oriented person. Because what Karaganov said in this interview very bluntly is that if this war turns into a big war, meaning involving other countries directly, he said Europe will cease to exist. He even alludes to the possibility that, given the fact that the European establishments that are not reconciling themselves with the fact that the Western dominance of 500 years of colonialism has ended, not ending, has ended, and that therefore they're driven by obsessions and have lost all fear of war, including nuclear war. Think about that. Can you be driven in your personal life, where crises will occur and arise from time to time, can you be so driven in the stress that goes with the crisis that you're facing that you start making decisions that are outside the bounds of reality? Out of urgency, out of desperation, out of just simply not knowing what to do, so you start reaching for things you otherwise wouldn't under normal levels of stress. So with that being said, what Karaganov said, he said maybe the last resort to handle this growing call for armament in Germany and other countries, and the reestablishment of a draft in Germany, and Pistorius, defense minister, saying, we want to be war ready by 2029. Karaganov said, well, maybe the last resort would be to use a tactical nuclear weapon to awaken them back to the fear of what nuclear war means. Now, here's a fellow representing the Russian government. And he says, well, you push and you poke the bear. He didn't say it that way, but that's what he's talking about. Maybe we just need to set off a tactical nuclear weapon. Now, he naturally doesn't want that to happen. But he says if that's the only way, then so be it. So obviously, his whole outlook, the Russian outlook, as portrayed by the media, is where Russia wants to reestablish the old Soviet empire. And if they're not stopped on the battlefields of Kherson or Zaporizhia, and they're allowed to cross the Dnieper and take Odessa, then all of Europe will be next. All of Europe will be speaking Russian in a matter of 2 or 3 years. And he says, that's crazy. We don't care about Europe. Our outlook is Eurasia. Now, when you get out your handy dandy little map of Eurasia, and you look at the size of Europe, and you look at the size of the Russian Empire, 11 time zones, and the size of China, then you can understand what he's saying when he says, our outlook, our plans, our development is the development of Eurasia. He said this. He said, Europe is just an ugly outgrowth of the Eurasian continent, like a wart. And he said the Russian identity lies with Eurasia, with the emphasis on Asia, especially Siberia, he said. And he says, we have no use for a European component in this picture. And so he dismissed the idea brought in by Pele of the argument given by Ted Postel that I have quoted many times, that there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear war. Well, he dismissed that. And he said, no, it's quite possible. He says, I don't think that's a legitimate argument, but in any case, I think it's useful for people to understand. It may come to that. So I think it's important to read this interview. There's a lot more in there than I have time to go into. But it just shows that a journalist should go in. I mean, it's an excellent piece of journalism. And it just shows that a journalist should go in after pursuing an issue until it's exhausted. So it wasn't like these news readers on evening TV or the Sunday evening news catch-up programs like 60 Minutes that asks 2 or 3 softball questions and then moves on to something else. She dogged this thing right down to the last minute where he said, yeah, it's quite possible to have a tactical nuclear war. But it should also tell people that those who are betting on regime change in Russia are just absolutely foolish. And if there were to be a regime change in Russia, they wouldn't necessarily get somebody more friendly to the West than Putin. So obviously, that solution does require a solution. And if the West is insisting on sending weapons to the Ukraine and troops, which the British are still doing, even if it would come to an agreement, their intention is to prolong the war to eternity, which must be prevented by all means. And the only way that can happen is through this global security development architecture. So there's a lot of other crisis spots, especially in the Middle East. And now Netanyahu is calling upon Herzog to grant him pardon. Pardon me, pardon me. How can I fight this more effectively against the horrors of Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and all these other bad, bad people if I have to worry about being thrown in prison for the rest of my life for corruption? Yeah. All right. Anyway, I want to mention that it's a good sign, I think, that 11 Democratic senators are now demanding an investigation into the Israeli war crimes. Naturally, it's too little, too late, but it's nice to see that some of the Democratic senators who realize they've got a good chance for massive victories in midterms in less than a year now. Boy, it's amazing, isn't it? The first year is over already. But because they have a good chance for victory in the midterms, 11 of them have come out demanding that Congress investigate the Israeli war crimes. Now, the other crisis spot is Venezuela, where the latest, it hasn't changed any from the last several days from when it was announced that there are 15,000 U.S. troops in the Caribbean. Now, I want you to parallel this thing along with the development of what was going on in the Hanoi harbor and the Gulf of Tonkin event and things that were leading up to the American invasion of Vietnam. With the coming U.S. invasion of Venezuela. Oh, we just want a regime change. Oh, we just want to stop those bad drug people. You know how you stop the drug trade? It's really simple. The way you stop the drug trade is you stop the U.S. banking oligarchs in Wall Street from laundering the drug money. That's all you got to do. If you can launder the drug money, they're not going to have any business. I mean, if you had a little printing press going on in your basement, and you were printing $100 bills, American dollar bills, with the most sophisticated paper, the most sophisticated ink, the most sophisticated scientists working with you that knew how to just duplicate the covering and the layering of these paper things that we call $100 bills. But still, there was the slightest little possibility of them being identified as counterfeit. But you had a buyer who would give you 35% of the face value in real $100 notes for all the ones that you could print. What would keep you from doing that? Especially if you were paying off the local constabulary to look the other way. And so you would print 1,000 of these $100 notes, and out of 1,000 of them, you'd exchange them for 350 of the real $100 notes. And you could crank that out every hour with your printing system. Why wouldn't you do that? As long as the drug trade can cover their trail, they can sit right out there on the front porch with everybody else. You want to stop the drug trade? You don't go in there and bomb Venezuela to the roots. You stop the enterprise behind it. Grab the oligarchs, the banking oligarchs who launder their money, drug money on a regular basis. Where's that laundered money go? Who's buying the laundered money? Warlords, for one, so they can continue their militia wars in various undeveloped countries. Someone said it all comes down to money anyway. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But right now there's 15,000 U.S. troops in the Caribbean. The USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, the largest aircraft carrier in the world, mind you, is sitting there with 11 warships. And there's reports that the U.S. has demanded food, lots and lots of food, for a long, long time for these 15,000 troops, indicating that they plan to have a more permanent, long-term presence in this region. Now, we all know really what's going on here, in the sense that it's after the oil. They're after the oil. The largest natural gas oil reserve in the world is sitting under Venezuela, and they're offshore deposits. The largest, bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than Iran, bigger than Syria or Iraq, bigger than Kuwait, bigger than Yemen, bigger than the United States. And that's what they're after. So that sword of Damocles is still hanging over the head of all of us. There was an article that just came out in Foreign Affairs, which made it very clear to eliminate the government of a country which is friendly to Russia, Cuba, Iran, and China. They want to kick out such a government to drive out the influence, especially China, but also other named countries on the Latin American continent. So that school is teaching that concept. The real reason that they're doing this is to stop the BRICS development of Central and South America. And that Venezuela is just a battle cry. Drugs, 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 and more drugs. So this continuing murder on the high seas of these alleged drug runners and these boats that can't possibly reach the United States. They can't even get halfway across the Caribbean. And they're murdered as soon as they're seen. We have to trust our government, and of course we all do that anyway, that these are really bad guys and really deserve death on the spot, irrespective of their inalienable rights from God, as the founding documents of the United States say. These rights are inalienable. Not just for Americans. These are human rights, inalienable from nature's God. So with no due process taking place, the only other thing you can call it is murder. Now, if the world would be short of strategic crises, I think the developments that are going on in Japan have to be taken quite seriously right now, because while Prime Minister Takaichi had a positive meeting with Xi Jinping in Korea, nevertheless, in a recent meeting in the parliament, she all of a sudden said, to the surprise of many, that if China is engaging militarily in Taiwan, that would represent a vital security situation for Japan, which would enable Japan to intervene in Taiwan militarily. Now, that naturally has caused an extremely harsh reaction from the Chinese government. And the reason is very obvious, because we're just experiencing now the end of the Second World War. It was the 80th anniversary here last month, or 2 months ago. The 80th anniversary. The end of Japanese militarism, which has done enormous damage inside of China. So you have this ghost of a recurrence of Japanese militarism, obviously being taken extremely seriously by China right now. So the Chinese have reacted extraordinarily sharply with things they're saying about Japan. So if the Ukraine wasn't enough, if the Middle East wasn't enough, if Venezuela wasn't enough, now you have China and Japan. So just to mention this last point I'm making here, domestically inside the United States here, it's also haywire. Following the shooting of 2 National Guard troops, one of whom just died, the other one's still in critical condition, President Trump has ordered practically the expulsion of all immigrants and the halting of all immigration from all countries in the developing sector. I mean, this is unbelievable. This is like this shooting that just took place this weekend in Compton, in California, would be the grounds to pick up every gun in California and turn them in. Does that make sense? Does it make sense that here's a fellow who has been associated with the CIA, who came here a number of years ago, got radicalized somehow inside the United States, but was associated with the CIA at one time, shoots these 2 people, and now President Trump wants to use that as grounds on a mess of nations. It's just, there's like 14, 15 of them. Because my first thought was my daughter-in-law, who's a Spanish national, but has her green card. Does that mean my daughter-in-law's got to go back to Spain? I mean, this is unbelievable. The United States used to be a melting pot. I mean, where everybody could become an American if they wanted to immigrate here. And the methods with which this is being enforced now is, well, ICE isn't attracting any friends. They're attracting members because you get a $50,000 sign-on bonus. It's kind of like the Russian army. The Russian army right now is 80% volunteer, but they get a heck of a sign-on bonus. And they get paid 4 times as much as the job they previously had if they were working for the government. And so now, in line with that are the outrageous remarks President Trump has made against South Africa. Not only did the United States not participate in the G20 in Johannesburg, but afterward, Trump said that South Africa is such a country that should not be allowed to be a member of any international organization. I mean, this is outrageous. South Africa should not be allowed to be a member of any organization. I don't think those are the best words President Trump can be using. So, as is the fact that Naledi Pandor, the former foreign minister of South Africa, has been denied a visa to the United States. I mean, this is the end of diplomacy. And the issue obviously is the stance South Africa has taken on the situation in Gaza. Because South Africa has called what's going on in Gaza, what it is, an ever ongoing genocide supported by the United States and Germany. And President Trump turns around and says the former foreign minister, essentially the Marco Rubio of South Africa, cannot have a visa to come into the United States because they are fighting against the genocide. and the accusation, and then President Trump kind of indicated that there's genocide against white people in South Africa. Well, to the best of my knowledge, while there are some terrorist things here and there, that's not very well founded. Terrorist activity and outright genocide on the part of the government are two different things. So if you look at all of these situations, which clearly, are a potpourri of the crises spinning out of control, it underlies the absolute urgency that these people sit down with a new security and development architecture which takes into account the interests of every single country in terms of security. And I can only say, the fact that President Putin just used the same formulations that have been proffered by the Schiller Institute, interestingly enough, for many years. And so I still have a lot of hope that the people in Europe who seem to be out of touch with the reality of how the global majority of the world is developing, that there can be a change, there can be a return to diplomacy as a way of conflict resolution. And then given the fact that Xi Jinping also has put similar proposals on the table, the Security Initiative and the Global Governance Initiative, which are being heavily discussed among the countries of the Global South, it remains what's it going to take to convince the Western nations to cooperate with the global majority? If they would agree to do that, all these problems could be solved relatively easily. However, I think, as I was saying there at the very beginning, all these crises that are going on in all the different parts of the world are just symptoms of the Western order collapsing after the last 500 years. And with each situation, each has its historic specificities, like the history of Israel and Palestine, the history of the Ukraine, the history of Venezuela. The common denominator here in all of these crises is that the old order is not agreeing with the emergence of the new order. So all these different ethnic, historic crises, specificities are being used to try to derail the emergence of this new order. The City of London and Wall Street do not want to lose their control of this planet. And when you have the idea of a new economic system based on such conceptions as been put forward by the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the development of the Middle East would be a natural aspect of it once you would have an agreement among the larger powers to cooperate. But when you can buy off these larger powers, and the leaders of these nations all seem to be reading from the same script. The end of Russia, the end of Russia, the end of Russia, the end of the Palestinians, the end of the Palestinians, the end of the Palestinians. And now you have President Trump saying that the United States now has control of the air over Venezuela, that the U.S. controls all the air over Venezuela. Just the political shock. And so here, there people who are dying right now for whatever reason, old age, this horrible thing that happened on I-15 the other night when a couple who are just starting their life together get hit by a DUI driven vehicle going on the wrong way on the freeway, killed right there in their car on the freeway. They're removed from what the rest of us are sitting here looking at. There will be people dying in Utah today from relative to disease, relative to old age, natural causes, all causes, whatever. And they're out of the picture now. But you are here. And I am here. And we're seeing these things unfold in front of us. And what an incredible time to be alive and to watch these things unfold. Which is the end, one of the major things, one of the major drivers behind this is the end of 500 years of colonialism, of slavery, of imperialism, of exploitation, and absolute misery for the vast majority of the world population. You know, there are still 600 million Africans without electricity. And it's this colonial empire that has ruled the world since the defeat of the Spanish Armada. And then over the next 200 years, even with the loss of the American colonies, the British Empire right up until the end of World War II, the largest, most extent, most powerful empire on the planet. Now, it's just an island off the coast of Normandy. But it's not giving up the fight. And I think when you have the proposals that are coming forth from Putin to establish world peace and safety, China's proposals for peace and safety, the 20-point plan, 28-point, whatever it is, for the Ukraine, that Russia actually is willing to sit down and talk about, there's an awful lot of hope here. And if you look at what is coming from many leaders of the global south, not just the biggies, like Xi Jinping or Putin or Modi or Lula, there are many of these secondary leaders in African nations, young people who are determined that they're going to fight to have a future. And so what do the oligarchs do to stop this development? Well, they foment these wars. They foment these militia, so-called militia events going on in sub-Saharan Africa. From the Ivory Coast straight over to Kenya, to Eritrea, and everything in between, to stop the development of these countries that are being offered by Russia and China. Hydroelectric power dams, highways, airports, universities, hospitals, paved roads. And so the colonials can't let go of that because they want all those natural resources for themselves. So when you look at what the young people are saying in Mexico, Brazil, Kenya, Uganda, and some of the European countries, who are recognizing that they've been under the thumb of London for hundreds of years, and now they're breaking free. You know that the global majority is 85% of the world population now? 85%. And many of these countries are becoming more and more advanced all the time. You just look at China. I mean, China, just 40 years ago, China was the most underdeveloped nation on the planet that had a population. Now it is the most developed nation on the planet because of all this limited free enterprise that the Communist Party has given their citizens. 850 Chinese have now come out of absolute poverty. And yeah, it's just middle class living, but they're living. Yes, their internet is regulated. Yes, they still have state police, but they're not nearly as present as they used to be. I learned that from my son, who lived there for 6 years. I've mentioned that before. I think it was long enough ago I can mention it again. Where when he first got to Japan, he went over there to teach English. It's like 25 years ago. And being a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white-skinned boy walking down the streets of Jilin in the Jilin province, gets stopped by state police about every street corner he crossed, wanting his paperwork. And even then, they kept a strong eye on him because they thought he was a spy. He didn't come to teach English, he came to spy on China. By the time he left 6 years later, he said, "Dad, you never see him anymore. You never see him." He said, "They're there, but you don't see them anymore. They're not as present as they used to be." Citizens are now coming out on the streets and selling in the open marketplace things they make in their homes, which when he first got there, you'd end up going to jail. Somebody found you out on the street with a bench selling whatever you could make at home at night. No, I'm not saying the Chinese way of life is the best thing for all of us. I don't mean to imply that. I mean, these things are changing. Russia's economy grew 3.5% last year during this war, while everybody else's economy, including our own, was losing ground. Russia moved ahead because of policies inside their government that allows this to happen, that we don't have, because our country is under control of these oligarchs. So this development of these natural rights in these countries that are starting to emerge, because the young people, you can't keep them down on the farm now that they've tasted smattering of freedom, are earnest to create a new economic system, to create a new development bank. And there's nothing that's going to stop that from happening except a nuclear war. Now, it's almost the top of the hour. I got some more I wanted to say about that, but I wanted to go into some of these comments of Putin regarding this peace deal. Now, when he was making these comments, he was dressed in military garb. Did you happen to see that? He's almost always in a suit, white shirt and tie, but he was dressed in military garb because he's the chief, just like Putin or Trump is, of the American military. He's the chief of the Russian military. Now, it gets a little tiring hearing all of these phony peace settlement charades, because I remember listening on the Napolitano podcast. I think it was Larry Johnson that said that peace plan was dead on arrival. There's no way in the world the Russians would accept some of the stuff that the West is saying that they have to have in order for this peace deal to go through. Well, Putin has finally delivered the definitive word on the entire matter during a recent trip to Kyrgyzstan, which is worth taking note because it answers key questions that have lingered in people's minds, particularly those of a concern that it might go through. And the biggest confirmation from Putin was that Russia was not given any real draft treaties, but rather more a list of informal points for discussion. And so that's what today Witkoff and Kushner are meeting with Putin today in Moscow to see what the Russian position is going to be right now. And so statements by Putin regarding the proposed Ukraine peace plans, he said there was no draft peace treaty only a set of questions that they want to discuss with the West. He said, overall, we agree that this could serve as a basis for future arrangements. He said, every word of the peace plan on Ukraine needs to be sat down and discussed seriously. He said, at present, some points of the plan sound ridiculous, like NATO in the Ukraine. Russia is all ready to formally confirm that it has no intention whatsoever of attacking Europe. Russian and Ukrainian intelligence services have always maintained contact, and that the Abu Dhabi venue is actively used for POW matters. The appearance of a U.S. representative at the Abu Dhabi talk was expected. U.S. representatives were going to be coming to Russia, which is today. And he said Russia will cease its hostilities against Ukraine only when the Ukrainian armed forces leave the occupied territories. Or, Putin said, when we achieve our goals militarily. And again, I always try to compare this to the surrender of the Japanese Empire in Tokyo Bay when MacArthur was there with the representatives of the emperor. I can't remember if the emperor was on the Missouri or not. But, when the United States was suing for peace a year earlier, and a lot of the Japanese government wanted to go for it a year earlier, 1943 or 44. But the war hawks, the warmongers, wouldn't allow it. There are certain things that Japan could have received as a part of a surrender peace plan a year earlier that they did not get in total surrender with MacArthur. And the same thing is brewing now in the Ukraine. If they were to sit down now and make some reasonable concessions to what the Russians want, no NATO in the Ukraine. And Russia is not going to give up any of its occupied territory because these are ethnic Russians. And the reason the special military operation happened was so that Russia could go in and protect these ethnic Russians from the Ukrainian bombing and shelling of their own citizens. The outlawing of the Russian church, the outlawing of the Russian language. And so the Russians said, that's enough, that's enough. And they're not going to back down from any of that. And if it goes to complete attrition, where there's nobody left to fight, and the Russian army is sitting there on the Dnieper, and now they have they're going to go after Kherson, they're going to go after Odessa, they're going to go after all of Zaporizhia. What's left? Kyiv. And when you have militarily gotten that far, you're not going to sit there and say, okay, we'll retreat, we'll go back home. That's nonsense. Because you'll just have to do it again. So, in short, kind of time we got. In short, this is Putin's way of downgrading the significance of the 28-point plan to a sort of very preliminary discussions, which is meant merely as it's like a menu. The serious discussions that will start today with Witkoff, and I don't know why Kushner is there, but Witkoff with Putin face to face. This is the meal. The comments that Putin has made up to this point about the 28-point plan was the appetizer. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff in there that we discussed in Anchorage and back in August, and there's a lot there we can agree with. So let's sit down and talk about it. But the real discussions will start today. Do you notice who's not there? Anybody representing the Ukrainians. Why? Because the war is over. Russia won. But Russia doesn't want to keep fighting. And Russia certainly does not want the Ukraine. They don't want to have to go in and take over the Western Ukraine, which are Ukrainians. They're still Slavs. The Russians are Slavs. They all have a similar ethnic background. But just hold on to the property where the people you're holding on to want you there. You don't go where they don't want you. Like American imperialism around the whole planet, where we move in and take over property, take over resources, and the people there shoot at us because they don't want us there. Boy, if I were king of the world, I could get these things settled so easy. So this is no different than Russia's reaction to what happened in Alaska, where the U.S., tried to dress up what was going on in Alaska as a final phase of negotiations, where Russia just considered it an informal chat. Just, I don't know if it's naivety or stupidity or what. But hopefully, when I do my show tomorrow, there will be something coming out of that meeting today that I can talk to you about. But when Putin was asked if he wants the war to continue until the last Ukrainian, to comment on the West's comment, to continue the war to the last Ukrainian, he said, well, in principle, we're ready for that. Because he said the war will go to the end if it's needed to go to the end. Then he said, some of the servicemen of the armed forces of the Ukraine, he said, we can see it in our drones. They look like homeless people. It's that bad. Is he going to stop the military advancement? No. No, not until all military aggression on the part of the Ukrainian army is over with. They lay down their guns, they lay down their weaponry, and surrender. And if you don't, we'll destroy you. So, Putin had some interesting updates. Ukraine lost 47,000 men in October. Ukraine is losing 31,000 per month. I'm out of time to go any further. I need to do a little commercial for my business. The 2-for-1 is still going on. It'll go on through this month. Man, does your head feel heavy? You have any numbness, tingling, pins and needles in your arms or legs when you wake up in the morning? These are such easy. Vertigo is so easy to fix. We've seen a rash of that for some reason lately. But two for the, and you don't have to come in together like I've insisted in the past. You come in one at a time. Just two for the price of one. That'll go on through New Year's Eve. You would call the office 801-523-1890. 801-523-1890 to get a consultation. Consultation's free. If you decide you don't want to do it, we'll still be friends. Or you can go to jackstockwell.com and sign up online, and the girls will get back to you about tying down a time that we can talk. But it's my Christmas gift back to the K-Talk audience, because that's the only people I'm offering this to, is the K-Talk audience, for having built my practice over the last 30 plus years. And I'm in my 31st year on the radio now with K-Talk. So I think that'll do it for today. Those of you on the stream, if you can like and subscribe, if you haven't already, certainly helps the algorithm. I really appreciate your audience and being a part of the program. So I'm going to end the stream. You guys just keep your